Just 30 seconds before I get into Troy Franklin here. This segment is part of a longer audio podcast that can be found in the description. It is a new show and I am still developing the production, including with improved audio this week. The video will be very similar in quality to the wide receivers 8 through 15 and the running backs 3 through 10 rankings last week. I do hope to continue to improve video quality as I go, and there is still a lot of good information throughout this piece. It's a nice information dump to take while eating a sandwich. I'll be releasing a video on Coleman and Thomas Jr. tomorrow and a video on Adonai Mitchell on Wednesday. And with that said, time to get into Oregon wide receiver Troy Franklin. So on to Troy Franklin, the wide receiver from Oregon. So when it comes to a lot of these profiles, I'm probably going to be handling the objective information first, right? The information that we know to be true, and maybe not even all the things that we know to be true, but are at least listed and will eventually become objective. And you'll know what I mean by that in a second. But Troy Franklin's age, I have down at 21 years, 7 months as of September 1st. That makes him the 10th youngest wide receiver on my list between the 2022 and 2024 draft classes, since there's only 9 above him. That means Drake London, Malik Neighbors, Keon Coleman, who I'll talk about in a bit, Kayshon Boutte, Marvin Mims, Xavier Worthy, Jameson Williams, George Pickens, and Jordan Addison. Those are the only 9 wide receivers I have on my list as being younger than Troy Franklin in the last 2 years. And then what I was talking about earlier, objective but not verified, his listed size from the University of Oregon, 6'3", 187 pounds. So the 187 pounds, probably the first thing you want to start on right there, right? That's going to be a BMI red flag for most people, and most likely. Again, we don't have the official measurements, but you don't really need the official measurements to just look at Troy Franklin and know that that's a guy who's probably skinny and probably going to be skinny his whole life. You know, different people have different body types. Obviously, there's an extent to which strength and conditioning programs can help, but there's also an extent to which people are just built differently. There's some people who have wider frames, or some people who have narrow frames, and that's just, the way things are. So Franklin does measure out well, or should measure out well, in height and length. I'm very interested to see what the official length is in particular, because having that length with his speed working down the field is a very intriguing combination. But the real important thing, and it is still getting into the objective parts of things, is that Troy Franklin, by far, on this list of 4 very good wide receivers, is by far the best analytical prospect. Troy Franklin really represents, in a lot of ways, and this is one of the main reasons I'm doing Troy Franklin first, the ideal of what I'm looking for when I'm looking over some of these numbers, right? Because not only did Troy Franklin hit the exact numbers I'm looking for, or the higher ends of those exact numbers, but he did it in a very natural or progressive way, I guess is what I'm trying to get. Where in his freshman year, he had over 15 receptions, 200 yards, 2 touchdowns, good, but not a ton, but exactly what you're expecting out of freshman. And he improved a good amount in his sophomore year. He ended up having 24% of his team's receiving yards. He had 32% of the touchdowns. Again, that's right in my goal range. And then he improved even more in the junior year, at least in terms of the yards, going up to 31.3%. Now, his touchdowns did dip slightly to 30%, but Troy Franklin's also probably not archetypal to be the guy that you're expecting to get a lot of touchdowns, especially compared to everybody else on this list. Mitchell, Thomas, Coleman, those are 3 guys that you're thinking are red zone warriors. Franklin's probably going to get most of his touchdowns from big plays and most of his yardage from big plays, or rather most of his fantasy points from big plays. So I don't think we're looking for huge numbers in the touchdown category, but 30 is still a very solid number for Franklin. And so, you're seeing this. Not only are these numbers very good, but they're representing a progression for somebody who is very young. So he comes in very young, does decent. Next year's a little older, does better. Next year's a little older, does better. And you also see things that he's getting better at as well, right? So, I don't use PFF receiving grades very often generally, but in terms of as a data point, but I think it's just cool to see it look exactly like this, because it goes from 63 to 75 to 87. Almost a perfect, with the decimals it's probably not, but almost a perfect linear progression, right? Pretty much the exact same thing with the yards per route run, right? 1.43, 2.34, 3.32. Great progression there in terms of yards after catch per reception. That has gone up each year with a big jump from the second to the third year or to the most recent year. And one thing you want to check for when somebody's yards after catch goes up is if they, were used in any kind of different roles. And I didn't do any kind of super deep digging into that specifically for, this kind of statistical analysis, but I will say his ADOT went up from his second to third year, which doesn't necessarily suggest that the role is the reason that his yak went up. It seems to suggest that maybe he's just getting a little bit better at it. And this is a little bit into the film stuff that we're going to get into maybe, and this may be kind of a transition into that. But I also think that you can see nuances growing in his film. Now, he might not be the most technical or refined in everything as a wide receiver, but he seems to have a bit more of a natural feel to the position, how to play off his guy, when to sit down, where to sit down, all kinds of things that can really help. And I think building those nuances that lead to consistency, I think those are the things that are hard for us to determine, that often are the reasons that certain wide receivers are successful over a long period of time. And then there was also kind of a false improvement, I guess is how I wrote it down on my list, which was just the hands. So he did flash a few drops in that freshman year, and then that kind of went completely away in the sophomore year. He even flashed good numbers as a contested catch wide receiver. And overall, he only had 2 drops in the sophomore year, despite going up over 80 targets. However, there were a lot more drops this year, including about 9 drops was the number that PFF got. But just in the games that I watched leading up to this conversation, there were 3 drops in 2 games in a row that I watched to start this evaluation in the Texas Tech and Utah game that I wrote on all 3 of them that they were just can't happen drops. And it's kind of like this double-edged thing to where it is a good thing that Troy Franklin is putting himself in position to have drops that can be this bad. But the thing is, drops aren't equal in the sense that some drops are just the difference between how far you're going to punt at the end of the day. But some drops are points. And Troy Franklin's had drops this year that were points. And he had a few of them. And so that's just, something to keep an eye on. When you look at his contested catch numbers over the last 2 years combined, put them together, it's really exactly what you're looking for a wide receiver like Franklin on the PFF scale. But the drops are something that are really going to be something that you got to look out for a player like this, because if you can break NFL secondaries so frequently that you can get away with drops, that's great. But most likely you're only going to break free a few times. And if you don't take the most of those opportunities, you're both not going to last long in the league, and you're not going to put up big fantasy points for your team, right? So next up, I have traits here, and the first thing I wrote on traits is just speed. And then in terms of going back a little bit to the yak thing, what's really impressive about Troy Franklin is just how well he keeps his feet. Not only in terms of from a balance perspective, but he keeps them moving. At every level of football, they tell you, especially in trenches type things or in running back type things, you keep your feet moving. Troy Franklin seems to do that really well too, as just a ball carrier. Now, he doesn't have the core strength or just the general power as a runner that if he gets squared up, he's going down. But if he gets a reflexive shot, if he moves to the point where the tackler isn't exactly squaring him up very well at all, he can really easily pull out of those and keep his feet moving and turn away and be a little bit slippery. And with his speed, one slip up from the defense from a boundary corner can be absolutely devastating. So it's a big thing to have in his game, because not every wide receiver, especially not every tall, thin wide receiver, has that naturally, because being tall isn't necessarily a good thing for, breaking tackles, because you got that high center of gravity. And, it's just a nice natural balance to see from Franklin. And that's going to be a positive to add to his repertoire as well. And then finally, and you really get to see this when defenders back off of Franklin, but Franklin is more than just the speed. He is the ability to vary his speeds. And you really get to see that a lot on his tape because, and compared to the other three guys that I'm talking about today, a lot of the other three guys on this list, yes, they do vary things. But compared to the way that Franklin gears up and gears down and sits on things and slows up and then accelerates quickly and then can do a little quick double move, and you can tell that he's selling defenders on things too. It really is a significant, trait or tool in his bag that is a significant positive and something that is a significant part of the way he can at least potentially have success at the next level. And then just talking about the bad traits a little bit, the one that's obviously going to come to mind and was kind of referred to a little bit earlier with the 187 pounds is just the play strength. Is he going to be able to survive press? I haven't found any tape of him having a particular issue against Pac-12 press, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's not going to have trouble at the NFL level with press, especially because I think you see a lot of these Pac-12 corners that aren't necessarily high level, NFL corners, and I think they're afraid to lean in and really try to jam them up and beat them. That's the real thing you're worried about, obviously, with that kind of press, is not that he's even going to get slowed up, but that he's going to get really manhandled by a couple physical corners every now and then. And, will that happen? I'm not sure. Maybe he's too quick. Maybe he's too fast, but we haven't really seen it tested in the same way, right? The physical build that you're going to think of with Troy Franklin is Devonta Smith. But Devonta Smith had a lot of tape at the SEC level against press coverage, and he was dominant against it. And so that's a very significant difference between the two. And then, there's just going to be all kinds of, you want to say that, well, that's a DPI. Well, that's a DPI. Well, that's a DPI. That's pass interference. But you're not going to get the call all the time. That's just the world. And Troy Franklin is going to have to deal with some things, with people trying to, move his angle and push him off of his spot and grab his waist a little bit and all kinds of things. And should some more of them be called? Maybe, but he's not probably going to get them all. And so how he plays through those little bits of contact, or if he can avoid those little bits of contact with his speed, is going to be absolutely vital to how he can succeed, or if he'll succeed at the next level. And then I did already talk about this a bit, but it's just the hands. The hands are more of a question. If you average out the 2 years, there's definitely not a concern at all with this speed archetype, with this length. But if he is more so the wide receiver in the junior year, a Ted Ginn comp could potentially come to mind as a scary one. Ted Ginn was a guy who could get behind defenses, but he dropped the ball. And I think something that I said as someone who liked Troy Franklin going into this year was I was really impressed at the improvement in the drops, and I wanted to see if the improvement in the drops and the contested catch percentage that he put up last year were sticky. And they were not. In 2023, they went down, and so that's just a significant factor. But at the end of the day, I just think Troy Franklin's someone who's very hard to design a scheme against, because if you press him at the line, you have a chance to completely bully him. But if you don't bully him, you're taking a big risk of him getting behind you. And if you give him space, a lot of guys, because they don't vary as well as Troy Franklin, because they don't sit as well as Troy Franklin, because they don't have as much feel for where the appropriate spot in the zone is, and because they also maybe aren't as good at having a chance to break the tackle afterward, they're less effective in that area. But because Troy Franklin does vary so much, when you go off coverage, it's not like he's just going to run straight at you and not know what to do about it. Because of all these little variances, I think that's where you can really see the way he's going to have success at the next level. And I also think that those little variances add to him consistently getting production, and that consistent production is showing up in the statistics, and why he's showing up as the best analytical prospect of these four. So, on a final note, while Franklin does have concerns stemming from his stature and some poor drops in 2023, there is just enough start stop, easy speed, and insane top speed for me to rank Franklin probably as my wide receiver 4 at this point. He was my wide receiver 5 coming into the evaluation, and there's really not a huge difference between the two right now, but I definitely don't think he's outside. Out of everybody here, I don't think he's outside the top 5 wide receivers at the end of the day. And so, especially under equivalent draft capital, I think that's the trickiest part with me right now with Troy Franklin. If Keon Coleman in particular, but really Keon Coleman, Brian Thomas Jr., Adonai Mitchell, if those guys go top 20, top 25, and Troy Franklin does slip to the 40th pick, the 50th pick, I'm going to pick those guys first probably, because even though I like Franklin and I do think there's a lot of misses at all these ranges at the wide receiver position, there's a big enough difference there and a small enough difference in my scouting grades for these 4 right now that I would bump Franklin to the bottom. And I'm a little worried that Franklin is going to be at the bottom of draft capital because of his size. But if all things are equal with draft capital, I think right now Franklin would probably be my wide receiver 4. Now, I do think Coleman and Thomas are probably the most likely to get drafted highly, and that's probably a decent segue into talking about the 2 of them, because they're the 2 I'm going to be talking about next. And that's all I have on Troy Franklin. If you like the content, I would appreciate it if you like the video as well. And do look out for my breakdown on Keon Coleman and Brian Thomas Jr., as well as A.D. Mitchell, which should be coming later this week. Take care.